Welcome to the final session of the day. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's my real honour to be introducing esteemed collaborator, thinker and change maker, Professor Susan Puisan-Locke for our final talk. And she will be talking about the Transforming Collections Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage project. And to introduce myself, I'm not the proposed chair, but I am here. I'm Eleanor Morgan, and I'm Artistic Director at MIMA, which is Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, a public gallery and museum in Middlesbrough, which is part of Teesside University. And since 2018, I've had the pleasure of working with Susan and colleagues in the Decolonising Arts Institute, including Professor Sonia Boyce, Anjali Dalal-Clayton, and Ananda Rutherford. We've worked together in a range of ways, first through the Black Artists and Modernism project, and then as a project partner in Tank, and also a project partner in 2020, a commissioning programme, which has been led by Decolonising Arts Institute. So we've been researching in parallel, really, and we as a team at MIMA have been learning with the Tank team. And through this at MIMA, we've audited our collection, we've reinterpreted and redisplayed it, and developed curatorial organisation-based research that's contributed to the project, but also put into practice some of the learnings and findings from the Institute more generally. So to introduce our speaker, Professor Susan Puisan-Locke is an artist, researcher and writer, and she's shown widely across the UK and internationally since the 1990s. She is Professor of Contemporary Art and Director of the Decolonising Arts Institute at UAL, University of the Arts, London. She was the PI on Transforming Collections, and prior to that, co-I on the AHRC-funded Black Artists and Modernism project. And today she'll share reflections and insights on this project, which was to unearth biases in collection databases, find connections and potential histories through the development of machine learning tools. So through this, she led analysis and critical research within a multidisciplinary team of art historians, technologists, artists, and museum practitioners. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Eleanor, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to the AHRC for funding and supporting our work. It has been an enormous privilege and challenge to lead the Transforming Collections project over the last 3 years, collaborating with colleagues across the UAL Decolonising Arts Institute and UAL Creative Computing Institute, working closely with Tate as our main partner. I want to express our thanks on behalf of the team to all our partners and collaborating organisations, some of whom are here, as well as over 30 collections and archives who participated in the project at various points. It's also important to acknowledge the past and present researchers who have contributed to different phases of the work, among them art historians, curators, museum professionals, software engineers, and artists. And I want to signal here both the interdisciplinary ambitions of the project, as well as the precarity and impact of short-term posts and temporary processes on the long-term sustainability of research, researchers, and relations. We cannot sustain the work without sustaining the humans. We're on the verge of talking about transforming collections in the past tense, but the work is, of course, far from over. Some background to acknowledge the continuities and contingencies. Transforming Collections builds on the work of the earlier AHRC Black Artists and Modernism project, or BAM, which ran from 2015 to 18, led by artist and UAL professor Dame Sonia Boyce, with myself and Dr. David de Bosa as co-Is. Conversations began in late 2019 and continued throughout 2020 about transforming collections as the Tate-led foundation project, Provisional Semantics, got underway. This was led by Emily Pringle with Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton and Ananda Rutherford on the team. For us, the original tank call to respond to the challenge of dissolving barriers and move towards a more unified digital national collection raised fundamental questions around spoken and unspoken divides, and the notions and ideals on which nations and collections are founded. It was at a conference in Manchester 25 years ago that Stuart Hall asked the still pertinent question, whose heritage? These projects, among others, over the last 10 years, can be said to share disruptive, anti-racist, counter-canonical, restorative, and reparative impulses. It's worth remembering that transforming collections developed amid debates around contested heritage, which both intensified and paled in the contexts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the resurgent Black Lives Matter movement, and ongoing eruptions of anti-Black, anti-Brown, and anti-Asian violence. 4 years on, you may have heard that the culture wars are over, apparently. Unfortunately, such wishful words risk seriously undermining and diminishing ongoing battles to address or even acknowledge the enduring harms of empire and colonization. And while these ongoing endeavors may be slow and tiring, it is vital that we also allow space somehow for the playful, even joyous reimaginings that are needed now more than ever to reimagine our past and future histories. Transforming collections shifted focus from earlier projects to examine how, structurally, systemically, persistently, and problematically, we come to know or forget certain artists and artworks. Whose voices, bodies, and experiences are centered and privileged within collections? How can the architectures, algorithms, and relations of power and oppression that structure and define collections' narratives be surfaced and transformed? And what could an equitable, inclusive, distributed yet connected, heterogeneous and evolving national collection look like? In 2016, an audit of just over 30 UK public art collections, led by Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton, produced an indicative snapshot of works acquired since 1900 by artists who might be identified, or not, as Black. Such works made up between less than 1% and under 4% of collections. In 2022, an extended and expanded audit, led by Anjali again with Ananda, found the best case scenario had improved slightly, if that can be said, to just under 5%. When any artist, maker, work, or object is defined in negative relation as non-white, non-European, non-Western, or persistently identified, differentiated, or differenced in racialized, ethnicized, gendered, sexualized, exoticized, orientalized, heteronormative, ableist, and otherwise othering terms, we have to ask, whose world and worldview remain centered? Whose knowledge, whose standards remain normalized? This quantitative audit data lends itself to potential misuse if the conditions and contexts of acquisition and interpretation and the very parameters of the metadata are not critically interrogated. It is essential that this quantitative data is analysed and contextualised with qualitative research into analogue as well as digital records, and where possible, ethical engagement with the artists themselves. Working with the sometimes, perhaps inevitably, chaotic, disparate and messy state of the data available, not diverted by the unattainable goal and red herring of complete and consistent records. Our researchers undertook close critical readings of disparate texts, from catalogue descriptions to interpretation panels, display captions, acquisition notes and policy documents, along with private and institutional correspondence and interviews. Transforming is more than a question of representation, which is more than a question of numbers, highlights, flavours of the month. Not merely how many, but also who, what, why, and how. Who is in these collections? What has been collected and why? What are the historical and contemporary connections, networks, and relations that have led to the nomination, selection, acquisition, exclusion, or rejection of particular works and objects? On what terms have they been chosen, funded, donated, agreed, or declined, deaccessioned? Who sits on which panels? What is and isn't recorded in these processes? How, subsequently, have artists, makers, works, and objects been named, framed, classified, or described? Who and what is cared for, or, conversely, neglected? Importantly, it is our close, critical, art historical, and museological research case studies that have fundamentally driven the interactive machine learning, or ML, development within the project, not the other way around. Our aims have been to surface and evidence patterns of bias, to resurface artists and artworks, to enable the cross-search to research into collections data using small bespoke data sets, and ultimately to open up new interpretative frames and potential histories of art, nation, and heritage. Steered by researchers' questions and collection partners' needs, the ML tool has been interactively developed, designed, and refined to support the analyses of available data, not to correct the biases or errors or to fill the gaps, but to help us look critically at what is and isn't there. What or who is named or unnamed, seen or unseen by human and machine. This collaborative, iterative process has been interestingly uneasy, at turns frustrating, revealing, and inspiring, requiring the mutual interrogation of common sense knowledge and assumptions. Against the backdrop of accelerating AI technologies and the very narrative of acceleration, mindful of the risk of multiplying harms, our approach has been somewhat at odds, deliberately slow, to deliberate and slow. As I've said elsewhere, interdisciplinary collaboration is much easier to say than to do. We've taken time to grapple with our respective individual and disciplinary biases and habits, still grappling, to understand the limits of what ML can and cannot or should not do. From the standpoint, then, that technical solutions are neither desirable nor possible in overcoming barriers that are not merely digital but also social, cultural, historical, and ideological, our team have developed a critical analytical tool, or CAT, which, to use, requires a deep unlearning of our normalized expectations, a rewiring of human and machine. As a critical spanner in the works, the ML CAT can slow down habitual workings and clarify individual thinking to sharpen the questions we want to ask of the data. Creating and training the ML cat requires careful iterative modelling, testing and refining of the question or task at hand, for example, to identify the presence of inaccessible language or Orientalist ideas or figures such as women, children, people of colour, depicted in an image but not acknowledged in the associated text. Building each bespoke analyzer starts with describing the task to apply in turn to a bespoke data set. It's a necessarily time-consuming, experimental and, as I say, revealing process that reflects back the assumptions, biases, choices and expectations of the user. How good or bad, useful or otherwise the tool proves to be remains the question. Can we, you, teach the machine to learn, to help us, you, unlearn what we, you, think you, we know? As the tool has evolved, so has its name. We're toying with Collections Transformer, which neatly mirrors the project name, but allow me to caveat and caution. The Collections Transformer is not a magic wand, not a laundry product, not a stain remover. It will not clean up the mess, remove the offence, or undo the harm. It may speed up a researcher's inquiry to some degree, expand the scope and scale of the material under analysis, throw up unexpected connections, but it cannot automate the work of analysis or change itself. That ultimately needs to be driven by you, by us. We know that museums are not neutral. We have to remember that machines are not neutral either, and nor are we. Last month, we presented a week-long collaborative public programme across Tate Modern and Tate Britain, marking the culmination of the Transforming Collections project. The title, Museum, Machine, Me, underlines the questions of power, agency, and responsibility at the intersection of institutions, technologies, and individuals. I'd like to outline some of the thematics and modalities of the programme, including a conference, displays, performances and talks, curated to highlight and activate the research, to foreground and engage wider communities of artistic practice research and to stimulate imaginations. The two-day conference at Tate Modern opened with a keynote conversation. Transmedia artist and educator, Professor Stephanie Dinkins, spoke to her use of emerging technologies and social collaboration to work towards technological ecosystems based on care and social equity. Her experiments with AI have led to a deep interest in how algorithmic systems impact communities of colour in particular, leading to the conclusion that our stories are our algorithms. She asks, what does AI need from us to ensure that these stories and algorithms are indeed ours? Professor Rubika Risam spoke to the multiple iterations of me implied in machine learning in museums. Her research on the entangled historical relationship between museum data and colonialism highlights its ongoing impact on cultural heritage data today. As she puts it, if our positionalities inevitably influence ML methods, then starting at me is essential to transforming museum collections with machines. The me of cultural heritage professionals, the me who is represented within collections, and the me who is excluded by them. What do museums want? Want in the double sense of desire and lack. Introduced by Professor Eva Luger from the University of Edinburgh with Professors Mick Grierson and Rebecca Feebrink, Dr. John Gillick and Ananda Rutherford, the first session outlined the challenges and collaborative interdisciplinary approaches negotiated within the project. The testing and contesting of assumptions and expectations, the iterative development of the ML tool whose critical analytical potential can only be realized through responsible ethical application by its users, the you or me in the equation. The second session, Please Give Generously, chaired by Christopher Griffin from Tate, saw Dr. Tamina Goska from the project, Melanie Keane, Director of the Wellcome Collection, and Dr. Alexandra White from Johns Hopkins University reflect on what and how collections keep. From keeping to caring, how do changing political, policy and economic landscapes impact the practices and ethos of collections? How does the language of benevolence and gift-giving reveal or obscure relations of power? What institutional and curatorial strategies might be mobilized to address uncomfortable legacies and suppressed histories? How can museums practice equity and generosity in a sector facing ever greater scarcity in order to redress, restore, and potentially give back? The third session, chaired by Eleanor Morgan from MEMA, focused on multiple case studies within the project by Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton, Dr. Alice Correa, and Dr. Andrew Cummings. Their close readings of digital and analog collections data and archival materials relating to Tam Joseph, Sonia Boyce, Keith Piper, Evan Souza, Gaminda Sikand, Hamad Butt, and David Madala, among others, surface repetitions, omissions, errors, and contradictions in the descriptions and interpretations of their work, while also pointing to possibilities for looking, reading, and writing otherwise. The final session, chaired by Dr. David DeBosa from Tate, brought myself and Dr. Charles Longvroyd from the Stedelijk Museum into conversation. We spoke to our positionalities in relation to British and Dutch colonial histories and our perspectives as artists, curators, researchers, ruminating on how collections and archives are mutually constituted, entangled and imbricated in national and international narratives. How we might attend to the multitudes of unheard voices within and without museums, and how artists, ourselves included, attempt to speak out, speak back, sound off, and sound out their presence and potential through serious and playful acts of interruption, disruption, reinvention, and devotion as forms of resistance. Beyond the conference, there were numerous pop-up talks and archival displays in Tate Britain's galleries and library spaces, led by project researchers including Dr. Ian Sargent in conversation with Hardish Verk on artists' archives outside the museum, Dr. Anjali Dalal-Clayton in conversation with Keith Piper on his major commission responding to the controversial Rex Whistler mural at Tate Britain. These, importantly, shifted the mode of public engagement from speaking to speaking with, to foreground the importance of embodied affective encounter in close physical proximity to the work and material archival traces that cannot be contained, that cannot be translated, that exceed our collections, digital and otherwise. There were hands-on participatory machine learning workshops at both Tates, which attracted wide-ranging audiences. These were led by Dr. John Gillick and Polo Sologub, whose keen engagement, the audiences and our facilitators, and enthusiastic feedback suggests the real-world usability of the ML-CAT or Collections Transformer. An expansive late-night program at Tate Britain multiplied the contexts and communities of practice research with numerous performances, activations, and interventions, including by Hyphen Labs, Karen Palmer, aka Storyteller from the Future, Gary Stewart of Dub Morphology, Caitlin Koranteng from Innova, and Electronic Life. It is arguably the experimental explorations of artists as practice researchers that most effectively and affectively amplify the possibilities and potentialities for interrogating the normalized, limited, limiting, harmful, and careless narratives of museums and technologies, to critically and creatively shake up and reimagine our collections and heritages. What happens if the global majority, we, choose not to identify or be identified, refuse our reductive marginalizations and minoritizations? We have and continue to disappear. How might we refuse these erasures, reappear and reassert our individual and collective stories, our past and future ancestries, our voices and multitudes otherwise? At Tate Modern, Evan Ifakoya turned the hard, cold shell of the Level 5 space into a series of soft, warm zones for encountering the artist Maud Salter in an act of digital devotion, with an audio-guided website as virtual shrine, personal archival materials, a reading room and screening, inviting contemporary artists to step into dialogue with the legacy of Salter's work. In the tanks, Christina Peake sculpted a coral-like island out of the concrete floor, carrying several objects aloft as if washed up or salvaged from marine environments. Animated by underwater footage and accompanied by intimate speculative narratives, each story called forth the spirits of their originary communities and cosmologies. Yu Chen Wang represented the visual tropes of the 19th century museum as a theatre set or props evoking the pursuit of beauty in art and architecture, intended to rectify the moral and physical ugliness of industrial capitalism, and hence divert attention away from its violent racial colonial foundations. And finally, Erica Tan assembled an array of sonic and visual elements supported by temporary structures made from materials reclaimed from Tate's store. Seeking to sound out the data on items relating to Southeast Asia from Tate and Wellcome collections, traversing art and medical histories, Tan fed this data through a diagnostic instrument made from fragments of instruments from Southeast Asia collected by her own mother. Tan calls the work an interrogation into the depths of museum collections, into states of health and well-being, and a search for kinship. For several days at Tate Modern and several hours at Tate Britain, these myriad interventions transformed the museum, its spaces and artworks differently enlivened, its audiences differently embodied with the voices and experiences of others, recentering, resensing, resounding other stories, hinting palpably at what the museum could do and be. To ensure such transformations are not merely momentary, fleeting gestures or passing spectacles, but embedded in equitable and sustainable change that recognizes and empowers us fully as humans, not segments, sorts, or types. We all need to ask, what does the museum and machine need from me? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I think that just demonstrated the real depth of research and the kind of interconnectivity with practice, so thank you. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. I'm very happy to kick us off if we need a minute to gather our thoughts. I guess one of the things that occurred to me is that you're signalling really how much more there is to do, how ongoing this is and how long-term the work is. Are there any questions from the audience at this moment? Okay, I'm sure something will emerge. So whilst it does, I will just ask you, Susan, what surprises or, things that occurred that you didn't expect were there in the project, either for you or for this interdisciplinary team that you gathered?
Surprises. I think the persistent gaps, the persistent contradictions, the disconnects between us within the project as a team, between us as a and our disciplinary perspectives, our positionalities, our languages, which sometimes sounded the same, but realized we were actually speaking to very different things. the gaps continually, more broadly, between what we say and what we do. So I made reference to the now very familiar, some call it a mantra, museums are not neutral. We know that, we say we know that, but what do we do? What do we do that to make that more than a rhetorical statement? Museums are not neutral, machines are not neutral. We say we know this, and yet we do not enough challenge and question the things we do and say and think in the day-to-day, our everyday habits. So despite acknowledging our non-neutrality, we don't interrogate enough everything that we take to be the norm or a norm. So that's a surprising reflection that I think we've all had in the project, and that there's a recurring kind of penny drop moment that we all experience. One of our co-Is, Christopher Griffin from Tate, has spoken to this many times, and then draws attention to the fact that, oh, the penny's dropping again, and it's a sort of, it needs to keep repeating. There isn't a moment of having figured something out, having got something, but that moment of matching the thought to an action, that realization keeps coming.
You knew it, but you have to keep finding it out over and over again.
Yeah, like a goldfish. Goldfishes in the museum, or cats.
Any questions from the audience or from online? Is there a hand there that I can see? Yeah. We'll come to you.
Hi, thanks for that. It sounds like there was a realization that that there are gaps, but I was wondering about the deployment of machine learning and whether there was an evaluation of how effective that was in terms of aiding the aims of the project.
So we're barely at the deployment stage. We've taken time to focus on how we develop the tool. But that's the question. How effective will it be is the question that remains, because we need to keep testing it. So I think this came up in the machine learning, the Transforming Collection machine learning workshop too, that the question of its deployability, usability, usefulness, or otherwise, is dependent on the user. And I think there were many surprises. Another thing that surprised us during the project was actually it's not that we couldn't develop something quickly, it's that we wanted to develop something slowly. And we wanted the development of the machine learning tool to be driven by the questions we were seeking to ask as researchers from various disciplines, the questions we're seeking to ask of collections. So very quickly, the idea that, we'll put together a tool quickly and it will help us solve this or do that in an automated way, in lieu of ourselves driving it. So the focus over the 3 years has been very much on the approach we take to development, with the hope that we can now move into deploying and testing.
Okay, there is one more question, and we've got time. I'm sorry, it's here about in the middle, person in blue. Sorry not to get to everybody, but we can talk after.
So, Susan, it was basically on that point around, and such a thoughtful presentation you've given, where the agency lies in that human machine language AI interaction, and balancing that so that the agency remains with the person and is supported by the tool. So I guess it's not really a question, it's just a reflection on that, if you have any further thoughts.
We are quite nervous, actually, excited and nervous about making it available. It is possible to make it available to be used by anyone with subject expertise or interest in a particular field, or what we're nervous about is putting in place enough guidance to encourage the careful, cautious, ethical application of the tool. Because I think, as with the gathering of data around artists who might or might not be identified as black in collections, it's not enough to gather the data. It's what you do with it, how you interrogate it, that's key. I think, as with any tool, technological tool, there are risks. And one of the questions I think going forward for us will be around how do we mitigate that, or make clear, if we can't mitigate it, how the ways in which we would like to see the tool not used, if that makes sense. I mean, we can only put the guidance around it and foreground the research case studies that have shaped the development of the tool in order to emphasize the human driving it. We're all much more comfortably, I think, than even 3 years ago, using this, evoking the human-centered, but we still have to ask which humans.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you.